It all started last winter break when I went back home to visit my family in upstate New York. I was catching up with my cousin Sophie, who had always been the adventurous one. We ended up at her friend Kelly's house one Friday night, just a small group of us. The plan was to play some games, have snacks, and hang out. But Kelly had other ideas. She brought out this old, worn Ouija board from her grandmother's attic. It looked ancient, with the letters and numbers faded, the planchette splintered at the edges. Kelly swore it was authentic and said her grandmother used it back in the 50s to communicate with spirits. I didn't believe in any of that stuff, and I said so, but the rest of them egged me on until I reluctantly agreed to play. It was me, Sophie, Kelly, and her friend Brandon. We dimmed the lights in the living room, lit a couple of candles, and placed the board on the coffee table. The air seemed to get colder the moment our fingers touched the planchette. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just my imagination. Kelly started by asking the usual cliché questions. Is anyone here? And what is your name? For a while, nothing happened. The planchette stayed still, and I felt ridiculous even being there. But then, the planchette started moving, slowly, almost hesitantly. Who's pushing it? I demanded, glaring at Sophie. She swore it wasn't her, and I believed her. Her hands were trembling. The thing was moving on its own, or so it seemed. It spelled out Elliot. Kelly asked, Elliot, are you a spirit? The planchette slid to yes. Brandon laughed nervously. Okay, this is weird. How did you die? The board answered, Murder. We all froze. I tried to keep my skepticism, but there was something about the way the planchette moved, deliberate and firm, that made my stomach churn. I tried to convince myself it was a prank. Someone had to be pushing it. Kelly, ever the fearless one, asked, Who murdered you? The response was immediate. Why? Oh, you. The candles flickered violently as if an invisible hand had swiped through the flames. Sophie screamed, pulling her hands back. This isn't funny, she yelled. Guys, it's just a game, Brandon said, but his voice cracked, betraying his nerves. He pushed the board away and stood up, trying to laugh it off. You're all freaking out over nothing. That's when we heard the noise. It was faint at first, like a creak coming from the basement. Kelly looked nervous. That's just the pipes. This house is old, she said, though she didn't sound convinced. Then it happened again. A loud, scraping sound, like furniture being dragged across the floor. But it wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from the room upstairs. None of us wanted to admit we were scared, but I could see it in their faces. Kelly tried to play it cool. Let's go check it out, she said, grabbing her phone for a flashlight. I wanted to stay put, but I wasn't about to sit there alone. We crept up the stairs together, the wood groaning under our weight. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was thickening around us. When we reached the top, we saw that Kelly's bedroom door was ajar. She swore she had closed it before we started the game. Hello? Kelly called out, her voice shaking. She nudged the door open with her foot, shining the light inside. The room looked normal at first. But then Sophie pointed to the mirror on the wall. There was writing on it, backward letters scrawled in something dark and wet. It read, Get out. The smell hit us then, metallic and sour, like blood. Kelly screamed and dropped the flashlight. The beam spun wildly, casting shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. I grabbed her arm and said, We're leaving. Now. But before we could move, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Brandon threw himself against it, but it wouldn't budge. Sophie was sobbing, clutching my arm so hard it hurt. And then we saw it. The shadow. At first, it was just a faint outline standing in the corner of the room, but as we stared, it grew darker, more defined. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, bony fingers that twitched and curled, its head tilted to one side as though it was studying us. The planchette from the Ouija board was in its hand. I don't know who screamed first, but it didn't matter. The thing started moving toward us, its steps slow and deliberate. The candles we'd left downstairs flared up, their light pouring into the room under the door. The shadows stretched and twisted, reaching for us like they were alive. Say goodbye, Kelly shrieked. We have to say goodbye. We didn't argue. Sophie scrambled for the Ouija board, which she had brought upstairs for some reason. I still don't know why. We all threw our hands on the planchette, shouting, Goodbye, goodbye, over and over. The shadow stopped. For a moment, the room was silent except for our panicked breathing. Then the door flew open and we bolted, tripping over each other in our rush to get out of the house. We didn't stop running until we reached the street. None of us spoke as we caught our breath and staring back at Kelly's house. The windows were dark and everything looked normal from the outside, but we knew better. Kelly refused to go back inside that night. She stayed at Sophie's house, and I crashed on the couch. None of us slept. The next morning, Kelly went back to her house to get some clothes. She called us an hour later, sobbing. The Ouija board was gone. She searched everywhere, but couldn't find it. Over the next few weeks, strange things started happening to all of us. Lights flickered in Sophie's apartment. Brandon said he woke up one night to see the shadow standing at the foot of his bed. Kelly's dog refused to go into the living room where we'd played the game. As for me, I started hearing whispers. At first, they were faint, just a soft murmur in the background, but they got louder and closer. One night, I woke up to find the word Elliot scratched into the wall above my bed. I haven't touched a Ouija board since. I don't even let people joke about them around me. Whatever we summoned that night wasn't just a game. It was real, and it's still out there. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand Ouija boards aren't toys. They're a doorway, and sometimes you don't get to choose what comes through.
Story number 2.
I'll never forget the summer I spent with my uncle and aunt in rural Pennsylvania. They lived on a sprawling old farm surrounded by dense woods that stretched for miles. It was a place with no cell service, no streetlights, and too much quiet at night. Perfect for someone who wanted to escape city life, or so I thought. On my second night there, I was rummaging around in the attic. The place was full of old junk. Rusty tools, cracked mirrors, yellowed photographs. But something caught my eye in the far corner. It was a Ouija board, half covered by a dusty sheet. Unlike the mass-produced ones you see in stores, this one looked handmade. Its surface was smooth, polished wood, with strange symbols carved into the edges. The planchette was carved from bone. I should have left it there, but I didn't. That evening, after my aunt and uncle went to bed, I decided to mess around with the board. I wasn't expecting anything to happen. I didn't even believe in ghosts. I just thought it would be fun. So I set it up on the dining room table, lit a candle for ambiance, and placed my fingertips on the planchette. "Is anyone here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. I tried again. "If anyone is here, give me a sign." Still nothing. I almost laughed at how stupid I felt. But just as I was about to put the board away, the candle flickered. Then the planchette moved. At first I thought it was just me, but the movement was too deliberate, too strong. It slid across the board with a purpose, spelling out a name, Lenora. "Lenora?" I said aloud. "Who are you?" The planchette paused, then moved to DEAD. My throat tightened, my heart raced, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I asked another question. "How did you die?" The answer came quickly. FIRE. A chill ran down my spine. My uncle had mentioned that the house had been rebuilt after a fire in the 1920s. I didn't want to believe it, but I asked the next question anyway. "Why are you still here?" The planchette spelled HELP. I pulled my hands back like the board was on fire. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. The candle flickered violently, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. I stumbled back, grabbing my phone for light. I wasn't about to stay there alone, so I rushed upstairs to my room, locking the door behind me. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind outside felt like a whisper in my ear. The next morning, I told my uncle what had happened. He laughed it off, calling it superstitious nonsense. My aunt, however, looked uneasy. She told me not to mess with the board again. I wish I had listened. A week later, I started hearing things. At first, it was faint, a soft humming sound in the middle of the night. I thought it was my aunt, but when I checked her room, she was fast asleep. Then, I started hearing whispers. My name, repeated over and over. One night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. It wasn't at the door. It was coming from inside the walls. I tried to ignore it, but the noises grew louder and more frequent. Scratching, knocking, whispering. It got so bad that I couldn't sleep. My aunt noticed the dark circles under my eyes and asked if I was okay. I lied and said I was fine, but I wasn't. 2 nights later, I was lying in bed when I heard something new, a voice. It was soft, almost childlike, and it came from right outside my window. "Come play," it said. I froze. My room was on the 2nd floor. There was no way anyone could be outside that window. "Come play," the voice repeated, louder this time. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The room grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging the air. Then the knocking started again, but this time it was frantic, desperate. The walls shook with the force of it. And then I saw her. A face appeared in the window, pale, hollow-eyed, with hair that hung like wet ropes. Her mouth was stretched into a too-wide grin, revealing teeth that were jagged and sharp. "Come play," she said again, pressing her face against the glass. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a pull, like she was drawing me toward her. I snapped out of it just in time and ran to my aunt and uncle's room. I pounded on their door until they woke up, babbling about what I had seen. My uncle grabbed a shotgun and went outside to check, but there was no one there. The next day, I was ready to leave, but my car wouldn't start. My uncle said it was probably just the battery, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was keeping me there. That night, things escalated. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I assumed it was my aunt or uncle, but when I opened the door, no one was there. The footsteps continued, moving up and down the hall, getting closer and closer to my room. I locked the door and backed away, clutching my phone like it could somehow protect me. The knocking started again, louder than ever. The walls shook, and I could hear something scratching at the door. And then the whispers returned. "Lenora," they said. "Lenora?" The lights flickered, then went out completely. I was plunged into darkness with only the glow of my phone for comfort. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. I thought it was over until I turned around and saw her. Lenora. She was standing in the corner of the room, her pale face illuminated by the faint light of my phone. Her eyes were black pits, and her mouth twisted into that awful grin. She lunged at me, and I screamed, throwing myself out of the way. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls closing in. I don't know how I made it out of there, but I ran down the stairs, grabbing the Ouija board from where I'd left it. I threw it into the fireplace and lit a match, watching as the flames consumed it. The air seemed to vibrate, and for a moment, I thought I heard her scream. After that, the house went quiet. The whispers stopped. The knocking ceased. But I knew better than to think it was truly over. The next morning, my car started without any issues. I left without saying goodbye, vowing never to return. It's been 3 years since that summer, but I still see her sometimes, in my dreams, in the reflections of dark windows, in the shadows that linger just a little too long. I don't know if she's still trapped in that house or if she followed me. All I know is that she's waiting, and someday she'll come back for me.
Story number 3.
The night it all began, I was in my college dorm, pulling an all-nighter to finish a term paper. My roommate Danny had gone home for the weekend, so I had the room to myself. Around 1:30 a.m., I decided to take a break and grabbed a soda from the mini fridge. As I sat back down at my desk, I noticed something odd. My laptop screen had dimmed, and the document I'd been working on was gone. Instead, the screen was black, except for 3 words written in bold white letters. "Do you remember?" I blinked, thinking it was some kind of glitch. But before I could do anything, the words vanished, replaced by something else. "Say my name." A cold chill crawled up my spine. My hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the screen returned to normal, my term paper intact. I convinced myself it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. I decided to ignore it and pressed on with my work. An hour later, I heard a knock at the door. It was soft, almost hesitant. I froze. Who would be knocking at my door at 2:30 in the morning? "Who is it?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. I hesitated before getting up and peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I opened the door a crack, enough to stick my head out. "Hello?" I whispered. Silence. I shut the door, bolting it this time, and went back to my desk. The room felt colder, though I hadn't touched the thermostat. Then I heard it, a faint whisper. At first, I couldn't make out the words, but as I strained to listen, they became clearer. "Say my name." The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my chest. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The only response was a faint laugh, dry and hollow, like leaves rustling in the wind. I grabbed my phone and called Danny, desperate for some sense of normalcy. The call went straight to voicemail. I texted her instead, but as soon as I hit send, the screen on my phone flickered and went black. That's when I heard the closet door creak open. I hadn't opened it all night, The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I turned to look. The door was ajar, just enough for me to see the darkness inside. I grabbed a pair of scissors from my desk and inched toward the closet, my heart hammering in my chest. "Is someone in there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No answer. I yanked the door open, ready to swing the scissors if I had to. But the closet was empty, just rows of my clothes hanging limply on their hangers. I sighed in relief, feeling foolish. But as I turned away, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow that didn't belong. It was tall and slender, its form barely distinguishable against the darkness. And then it moved. I dropped the scissors and stumbled backward, falling onto my bed. The shadow slithered out of the closet, its movements unnatural, like it was folding and unfolding itself as it advanced. It stopped at the foot of my bed. "Say my name," it whispered, its voice echoing inside my head. I don't know your name," I stammered, my voice cracking. The shadow seemed to shift, its form growing taller and more menacing. "You do remember?" it hissed. "Think?" Memories I'd long buried began to surface. When I was 10, I had an imaginary friend named Lily. She'd been my constant companion, someone I talked to when I felt lonely. But as I grew older, I forgot about her, dismissing her as a childish figment of my imagination. Could this thing be her? Lily? I said hesitantly. The shadow froze, then began to laugh, a high, shrill sound that made my skin crawl. "Not Lily," it spat, "but close." I racked my brain, trying to remember more. There had been another name, one I hadn't thought of in years. When I was a kid, I had been obsessed with ghost stories. One summer, I'd read about a girl named Eleanor who had died in a fire. For weeks after, I pretended she was my imaginary friend too. "Eleanor," I whispered. The shadow leaned closer, its face, or what passed for a face, mere inches from mine. "You forgot me," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You left me in the dark." "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't mean to." Eleanor, or whatever this thing was, didn't seem to care. The room grew colder, and I could feel her anger radiating off her in waves. "I waited," she said, her voice growing louder, more distorted. "I waited, and you never came back." The walls of the room began to shake, and the lights flickered wildly. My ears filled with a deafening roar, like the sound of 1,000 screams. "Please," I begged. "What do you want from me?" The shadow loomed over me, its form shifting and writhing. "I want you to remember. I want you to see." Before I could respond, the room dissolved around me, replaced by a scene I didn't recognize. I was standing in a small, dilapidated house. The walls were scorched black, the air thick with the smell of smoke. A little girl stood in the corner, her back to me. She was wearing a white dress stained with soot, her long hair tangled and matted. "Eleanor?" I said tentatively. The girl turned to face me. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. Her lips curled into a twisted smile. "You left me," she said, her voice echoing with pain and fury. "I didn't know," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't know you were real." "You made me real," she said, stepping closer. "You gave me a name, a story, and then you abandoned me." "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Please, I'm so sorry." Her smile widened, revealing jagged broken teeth. "Sorry isn't enough," she said. The house began to crumble around us, flames licking at the walls. The heat was unbearable, and I could barely breathe. And then I was back in my dorm room, lying on the floor. The lights were out, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. The shadow was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I packed my things and left campus, moving back home without telling anyone why. It's been years since that night, but I still see her sometimes, in my dreams, in dark corners, in the reflections of mirrors. She's always watching, always waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice. "Say my name."
Story number 4.
I wasn't supposed to be working the night shift that week. It was a last-minute swap with a coworker who had called out sick. I didn't mind too much. The pay was better, and the convenience store where I worked was usually quiet after midnight. The store sat on the edge of town, surrounded by woods. Locals often told stories about strange things happening in those woods. Disappearances, ghost sightings, even rumors of a cult. But I dismissed it all as small-town superstition. That was until one night I stopped dismissing anything ever again. It started at 2:14 a.m. I remember the time because I was staring at the clock, counting down the minutes until my shift ended. That's when the doorbell chimed, signaling a customer had entered. At first, I didn't see anyone. Then a man stepped into view. He was tall and gaunt, wearing a tattered coat that looked like it had been dragged through the mud. His hair was greasy and unkempt, and his eyes, there was something deeply wrong with them. They were too wide, too bright, like he hadn't blinked in days. "Good evening," I said, forcing a smile. He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me. "Can I help you find something?" I asked, my voice faltering. Slowly, he walked to the back of the store, disappearing down the snack aisle. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I told myself he was probably just some drifter passing through, but something about him unsettled me. Minutes passed. He didn't come back to the counter. "Sir?" I called out. No response. I left the safety of the register and walked toward the back of the store. The aisle was empty. "Sir, we're closing soon," I lied, hoping it would coax him to leave. Still nothing. Then I heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the employee-only door that led to the stockroom. "Sir, you can't go back there," I said, my voice louder now. The tapping stopped. I reached for the door handle, hesitating for a moment before pulling it open. The stockroom was pitch dark. "Sir, if you're in here, you need to leave," I said, fumbling for the light switch. The fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the rows of shelves. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy, like something unseen was watching me. I turned to leave, but as I did, the lights flickered again and went out, plunging the room into darkness. That's when I heard the whisper. It was faint, almost like wind through the trees, but unmistakable. "Help me," it said. I spun around, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" No answer. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." It was coming from deeper in the stockroom. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, moving between the shelves. The whisper grew louder with each step. "Help me, please." I rounded a corner and froze. There, in the far corner of the room, was a woman. She was crouched on the floor, her back to me. Her long, tangled hair hung over her shoulders, and she was rocking back and forth, muttering the same words over and over. "Help me, help me. Ma'am, are you okay?" I asked, taking a cautious step toward her. She stopped rocking and went completely still. The silence was deafening. Then, slowly, she turned her head to look at me. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were too large, her mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her teeth, jagged and sharp, glinted in the dim light. "Help me," she said again, but her voice was no longer human. It was deep and guttural, like it was coming from somewhere far away. I stumbled backward, tripping over a box and falling to the floor. She stood up, her movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. Her grin widened and she started walking toward me. I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of the stockroom, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock it. The store was silent. I stood there for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the door, trying to catch my breath. Then the doorbell chimed again. I whipped around to see the same man from earlier standing at the counter. Only now, his face was twisted into the same unnatural grin as the woman in the stockroom. "Help me," he said, his voice identical to hers. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the front door. As I ran outside, I glanced back at the store. The lights were flickering violently, and through the glass I could see them, both the man and the woman. They were standing side by side, grinning at me. And behind them, in the darkness of the stockroom, were more figures. Dozens of them, their glowing eyes staring straight at me. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were trembling so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. They were standing in the parking lot, watching me leave. I quit the next morning. I didn't even bother going back to collect my last paycheck. For weeks, I had nightmares about that night. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, hearing their whispers in the dark. I tried to move on, to convince myself it was just a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But 2 nights ago, I heard it again. A faint whisper coming from the hallway outside my apartment. "Help me. I know it's only a matter of time before they find me again."
Story number 5.
The house had been in my family for generations, a sprawling Victorian monstrosity perched on the edge of a small New England town. I inherited it from my grandmother, who passed away suddenly last winter. She always warned me about the house, though I never took her seriously. "Some things don't want to be disturbed," she'd say, her voice trembling. "Especially in this house." I chalked it up to the ramblings of an old woman, but standing on the front porch for the first time, staring at the peeling paint and dark windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The first few nights were uneventful. The house creaked and groaned like any old structure, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. I spent my days cleaning, sorting through dusty boxes, and uncovering remnants of my family's past. In one of the upstairs closets, I found an old trunk filled with faded photographs, brittle letters, and a single weathered journal. The journal belonged to my great-great-grandmother, Eleanor, who had lived in the house when it was first built. Her entries were mundane at first, notes about the weather, social gatherings, and household chores. But as I read on, her tone grew darker. "There's something in the attic," she wrote one day. "I hear it at night, scratching and whispering. James says it's just the wind, but I know better." I frowned, flipping through the pages. The entries became more frantic, her handwriting almost illegible. She spoke of shadows moving in the corners of her vision, of voices calling her name, of a growing dread that consumed her. The final entry was short. "It wants me. God help us all." I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. It was just a story, I told myself, a figment of a woman's imagination. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house set my nerves on edge. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to a loud thud above me. The attic. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a box had fallen over. But the sound came again, followed by a faint scratching, like nails on wood. I lay there, frozen, until the noise stopped. The next morning, I decided to investigate. The attic door was at the end of the upstairs hallway, a small square hatch in the ceiling with a pull-down ladder. Dust rained down as I tugged the cord they had, and the ladder creaked ominously as I climbed up. The attic was suffocatingly hot, the air thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Boxes and old furniture were piled haphazardly, casting long, eerie shadows in the dim light filtering through the single grimy window. I moved cautiously, shining my flashlight into the corners. That's when I saw it. A small, child-sized rocking chair positioned in the center of the room. It was old and worn, the paint chipped and faded, but what caught my attention was the way it was moving, rocking gently back and forth as if someone had just been sitting in it. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The room was completely still. No draft, no breeze. And yet, the chair continued to move. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and climbed down the ladder as fast as I could. I slammed the attic door shut and locked it, as if that could keep whatever was up there contained. That night, the noises started again, louder this time. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth above my head. The scratching returned, accompanied by faint whispers I couldn't make out. I buried my head under the covers, praying for morning. The next day, I called a locksmith to change the locks on the front and back doors. I didn't tell him why, I didn't want to sound crazy, but he must have sensed my unease. "Old houses like this," he said, handing me the new keys. "They have a way of holding on to things." That night, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer coming from the attic. They were in the walls, the floor, the very air around me. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing. I tried to drown them out with music, but it didn't help. The voices seeped into my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. And then, around midnight, I heard it. A soft, childlike giggle coming from the hallway. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by my bed and crept to the door. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the stained glass window at the end. I strained my ears, listening. Another giggle, closer this time. I turned to the stairs and saw her. She was standing at the top of the staircase, a little girl no older than 6. Her dress was white and tattered, her bare feet dirty. Her long hair hung in tangled strands over her face, and she clutched a ragged stuffed bear in her hands. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. She tilted her head as if confused by the question. Then she pointed at me with one small, pale hand. "It's your turn," she said, her voice high and sing-song. "My turn for what?" I asked, taking a step back. Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. "To play." Before I could react, she vanished, her form dissolving into shadows that slithered down the stairs and into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. The walls shook, and the air grew unbearably cold. By dawn, I had packed a bag and was ready to leave. I didn't care about the house anymore. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. But as I reached the front door, I stopped. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive. Slowly, I turned around. She was there, standing in the living room, her dark eyes fixed on me. "You can't leave," she said, her voice echoing with an otherworldly cadence. "You're part of the game now." The room spun, and I felt myself being pulled backward as if the very house was swallowing me whole. The last thing I saw was her smile, wide and cruel, before everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting in the rocking chair in the attic. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and I could feel something cold and slimy wrapped around my wrists and ankles, binding me to the chair. In the shadows, I saw them, figures, dozens of them, their faces twisted and unrecognizable. They whispered to one another, their voices merging into a cacophony of madness. And then she stepped forward, the little girl, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Now it's your turn to wait," she said, her voice soft but filled with malice. "For what?" I managed to choke out. "For the next one," she replied. "The house always needs someone." Her laughter echoed in my ears as the figures closed in around me. I screamed, but no sound came out. The house had claimed me, and now I'm part of the game, waiting in the dark for the next unfortunate soul to step through its doors.
Story number 6.
I moved into the old apartment building on a whim. It was cheap, conveniently located, and despite its crumbling facade, it had a certain charm. The landlord told me it had been around since the 1920s, and I could feel its history in every creak of the floorboards and every drafty window. There was only one rule: don't disturb apartment 6C. I thought it was a joke at first. The landlord, a wiry man in his 60s, handed me my keys with a nervous smile and repeated himself. "Whatever you do, don't knock on the door, don't try to look inside, and for God's sake, don't go in there." I laughed it off, assuming it was some old superstition or a quirky part of the building's lore, but his expression didn't change. "I'm serious," he said, lowering his voice. "The last tenant who went into 6C didn't come back out." I nodded, humoring him, but the moment I walked away, I dismissed his warning entirely. The first week was uneventful. My days were spent unpacking, exploring the neighborhood, and getting used to the oddities of the old building. The radiator clanked loudly at night, the pipes groaned whenever someone used the water, and the elevator made unsettling grinding noises. It was all part of the charm, I told myself. But then I started noticing strange things. It began with the smells. The hallway outside apartment 6C always reeked of something foul, an acrid mix of rotting meat and burnt hair. No matter how many times the janitor cleaned the floors or sprayed air freshener, the stench would creep back within hours. Then there were the noises. Every night, without fail, I'd hear faint sounds coming from behind the door of 6C. At first, it was just the occasional creak or thud like someone shifting furniture. But soon, the noises grew louder, footsteps pacing back and forth, muffled voices, and once the unmistakable sound of laughter. The thing is, 6C was supposed to be empty. I asked the landlord about it one morning, casually bringing up the noises I'd been hearing. His face turned pale, and he quickly changed the subject. "Don't pay it any mind," he muttered. "It's just the building settling." But I could see the fear in his eyes. By the second week, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate. It was a Wednesday night around 11:30 p.m. when I finally worked up the nerve. The hallway was silent except for the hum of the flickering fluorescent lights. I stood outside apartment 6C, staring at the tarnished brass numbers on the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on a table. It was coming from just on the other side of the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how still the air had become. And then, from behind the door, I heard a voice. "Who's there?" It was a woman's voice, soft and sweet, but with an edge that made my skin crawl. "I'm your neighbor," I stammered. I heard noises and wanted to make sure everything's okay. There was a long pause. "Come in," the voice said finally. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to walk away, but my curiosity outweighed my fear. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. It turned easily, as if the door had been waiting for me. The room beyond was pitch black. "Hello?" I called out, stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind me, and I jumped, fumbling for the light switch. When the overhead bulb flickered to life, I froze. The apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, not even a layer of dust, just bare walls and a cold, sterile floor. But the smell was overwhelming, a suffocating stench that made my stomach churn. "Hello?" I said again, my voice echoing eerily in the empty space. Something moved in the corner of my vision. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. And then I heard it, the soft, rhythmic tapping now coming from the ceiling. I looked up, and my blood ran cold. A woman was crouched on the ceiling, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Her head was cocked to the side, and her eyes, milky white and unblinking, bored into mine. "Why did you come here?" she hissed, her voice dripping with malice. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She dropped from the ceiling with a sickening thud, landing on all fours like an animal. Her movements were jerky, like a puppet being yanked on strings, as she crawled toward me. "I told you not to come," she whispered, her face inches from mine. Her breath was rancid, her teeth yellowed and jagged. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and fell to the floor. She leaned closer, her cold hand brushing against my cheek. "Now you can't leave," she said, her lips curling into a grotesque smile. I scrambled to my feet and bolted for the door, yanking it open and slamming it shut behind me. I ran back to my apartment, my chest heaving, and locked the door. That night, I didn't sleep. The noises didn't stop. The tapping, the laughter, the whispers. They followed me, growing louder and more insistent. The next morning, I went straight to the landlord. "I need to move out," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't argue. He simply handed me a release form and wished me luck. As I packed my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of fear through my chest. When I finally carried the last box to my car, I glanced up at the building one last time. The window of apartment 6C was open, and she was standing there, watching me. Her grin was wide, too wide, and her pale hand raised in a slow wave. I sped away, vowing never to return. But even now, weeks later, I can still hear her voice in the dead of night. "Now you can't leave."
Story number 7.
I'll never forget the night my sister and I decided to explore the old Holloway farm. It was the kind of place kids in our small town whispered about. The house no one dared go near, much less enter. People said it was cursed, that bad things happened to anyone who stepped foot on the property. But when you're 17 and desperate for a thrill, logic takes a back seat. My sister Emily, always the fearless one, convinced me it would be fun. "It's just an old house, Nate," she said, her flashlight bouncing off the cracked pavement as we approached. "What's the worst that could happen?" The Holloway farm sat at the edge of town, a hulking, decrepit structure surrounded by overgrown fields and a forest that seemed to press in on all sides. The house itself was a 2-story monstrosity, its windows shattered, its roof sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. We climbed through a gap in the rusted gate, our footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. The air felt different here, heavy, oppressive. I tried to shake off the unease that settled in my chest, but it only grew stronger as we got closer. Emily reached the front door first, pushing it open with a groan of ancient hinges. "Ladies first," she said with a grin, gesturing for me to go in. "Very funny," I muttered, stepping inside. The interior was worse than I'd imagined. The floorboards creaked ominously under our weight, and the walls were stained with water damage and something darker I didn't want to think about. Cobwebs hung like curtains from the ceiling, and the air smelled of mold and decay. Emily swept her flashlight across the room, revealing a staircase to our left and a hallway that led deeper into the house. "Let's check upstairs," she said, already heading for the stairs. "Wait," I said, my voice trembling. "Shouldn't we stick to the ground floor?" She rolled her eyes. "Come on, Nate. Where's your sense of adventure?" Reluctantly, I followed her up the stairs. Each step groaned under our weight, and I half expected the whole thing to collapse beneath us. At the top, we found ourselves in a long hallway lined with doors. Most were closed, but one at the far end was slightly ajar. Emily headed straight for it. Emily, maybe we shouldn't, but she was already pushing the door open. The room beyond was a bedroom, its furniture still eerily intact despite the years of neglect. A 4-poster bed stood against one wall, its mattress stained and sagging. A wardrobe loomed in the corner, its doors slightly open, revealing shadows within. Emily stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping the room. "Creepy," she said, but there was a note of unease in her voice now. I stayed in the doorway, my eyes darting around nervously. That's when I saw it, something small and pale sticking out from under the bed. "Emily," I whispered. She turned, following my gaze. Slowly, she crouched down, aiming her flashlight at the object. It was a doll, its porcelain face cracked, its glass eyes staring lifelessly ahead. "Gross," Emily said, picking it up. The moment she touched it, the air in the room changed. The temperature plummeted. and an icy draft swept through the space. "Put it back," I said, my voice shaking. But before she could respond, the wardrobe doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. We both screamed, and Emily dropped the doll, its head shattering as it hit the floor. The sound echoed through the room, followed by a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing her arm. We bolted down the hallway, the floorboards creaking and groaning beneath us. The growling grew louder, joined by a series of sharp, rapid thuds. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, chasing us. We reached the stairs and hurtled down, barely keeping our balance. As we hit the ground floor, I glanced over my shoulder and froze. At the top of the stairs stood a figure, tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, too sharp. It started down the stairs, its movements jerky and inhuman. "Move!" Emily screamed, shoving me toward the front door. We burst outside, the night air hitting us like a slap. But the relief was short-lived. The front door slammed shut behind us, and we heard the unmistakable sound of a lock clicking into place. We sprinted back down the driveway, not daring to look back. The gate creaked as we pushed through it, and only then did we stop to catch our breath. "Did you see that?" I gasped. Emily nodded, her face pale. We didn't talk on the walk home, both of us too shaken to process what had happened. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, its glowing eyes and impossibly wide grin. The next day, Emily seemed determined to pretend it hadn't happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. It started small, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a cold spot in my room. But then, at night, I'd hear footsteps outside my bedroom door, soft and deliberate. Emily refused to talk about it, brushing off my concerns as paranoia. But one night, I woke up to the sound of her screaming. I ran to her room and found her sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "It was here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was standing right there." I followed her gaze to the corner of the room, but there was nothing there. "We need to tell someone," I said. "The police, the landlord, anyone." "No," Emily said quickly. "We can't." "Why not?" She looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "Because it won't let us." That was the last conversation we had about the Holloway farm. Emily grew quieter after that, withdrawn. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating. I tried to get her to talk, but she would just stare at me with hollow eyes, as if she wasn't really there anymore. A week later, she disappeared. Her bed was empty when I woke up, the sheets neatly folded. Her phone and wallet were still on her desk. The police searched for weeks, but there was no trace of her. I knew where she had gone. I tried to forget, to move on, but the memories of that night haunted me. And then one evening, I came home to find a doll sitting on my bed. A porcelain doll with cracks spidering across its face. Its glass eyes stared at me, unblinking, and its lips were curled into a familiar, too-wide grin.
Story number 8.
It was late October, the time of year when the air grows crisp and the veil between the living and the dead is said to be thinnest. I was driving back to my hometown after 10 long years away, the memories of why I'd left gnawing at the edges of my mind. The road wound through dense woods, the headlights of my car slicing through the darkness. I was about halfway there when the car's radio crackled to life, interrupting the static I'd been using to fill the silence. "Turn back," a voice said, faint but unmistakable. I jerked the steering wheel slightly in surprise, my heart hammering. "What the hell?" I muttered, glancing at the radio. The dial hadn't moved, but the static was gone, replaced by silence. I shook it off, telling myself it was just a malfunction. But as I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't long before I saw the figure. She was standing on the side of the road, her back to me, long dark hair hanging in tangles down her back. She wore a white dress that looked almost gray in the moonlight. I slowed the car, rolling down the window. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. Something about her made my skin crawl. I rolled up the window and drove on, glancing in the rearview mirror. She was gone. The woods stretched on endlessly, and the roads seemed to grow darker the further I went. My GPS had lost signal hours ago, and I hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. And then I saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road this time, facing me. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, and her eyes, dark and hollow, stared directly into mine. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop just feet away from her. "What the?" I started, but the words caught in my throat. She smiled, It wasn't a warm smile or even a mischievous one. It was a smile that spoke of something dark, something wrong. Her lips stretched too far, her teeth too sharp. I threw the car into reverse, my hands shaking, and backed up as quickly as I could. When I looked forward again, she was gone. My chest heaved as I tried to calm my breathing. "You're just tired," I told myself. "You're seeing things." But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I turned the car around, deciding I'd take the long way back, if it meant avoiding whatever was on this road. But as I drove, I realized something horrifying. No matter how far I went, the same trees passed by my window. The same curves in the road appeared before me. It was as if I were driving in circles. And then the radio crackled again. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice said, clearer this time. A chill ran down my spine. "Who is this?" I shouted, but the radio went silent again. The car sputtered and the headlights flickered. "No, no, no," I muttered, gripping the wheel as the car rolled to a stop. I tried the ignition, but it wouldn't turn over. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the cold wind outside. And then I heard it, a faint tapping on the driver's side window. My heart stopped. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. It was her. Her face was pressed against the glass, her hollow eyes boring into mine. Her smile was wider now, impossibly so, stretching up her cheeks like a grotesque mask. I screamed, scrambling to unlock my seatbelt. I threw open the door on the passenger side and bolted into the woods, my pulse pounding in my ears. Branches scratched at my face and arms as I ran, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. The forest was a labyrinth, the trees all looking the same. I had no idea where I was going, but anywhere was better than the road. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing and collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. The moonlight illuminated the space, and for a moment I thought I was safe. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching through the leaves. They were slow and deliberate, each step sending a jolt of terror through my body. I looked up, and there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing. Her head tilted further this time, almost unnaturally so, as if she were studying me. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice cracking. She didn't answer. Instead, she started to move toward me, her steps jerky and unnatural. It was as if she were being pulled by invisible strings, her limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. I scrambled to my feet and backed away, but she was faster. In an instant, she was inches away from me, her icy hand gripping my wrist. "You shouldn't have come back," she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. Her touch was freezing, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The world around me seemed to spin, and darkness crept in at the edges of my vision. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of the road, my car parked a few feet away. The engine was running, and the headlights illuminated the empty stretch of pavement ahead. I sat up, my body aching, and looked around. The woods were silent, and there was no sign of her. Shaking, I climbed back into the car and drove away, not caring where the road led as long as it was far from that place. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station on the outskirts of town. The clerk looked up as I stumbled inside, my face pale and my hands trembling. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a chuckle. I didn't laugh. "Do you know anything about the road that cuts through Holloway Woods?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The clerk's smile faded. "You took that road?" he asked, his expression turning serious. I nodded. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "Most people who see her don't make it out." I didn't ask who her was. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I was never going back. But even now, months later, I can't escape her. Sometimes when I'm driving at night, I'll catch a glimpse of her in my rearview mirror, standing by the side of the road, and every time I hear her voice in my head. "You shouldn't have come back."